Hello, everybody. Welcome to Mon Carne de Poche. This is a new little series that I am starting for plenty of reasons. One of them is just because I'm a nerd and I love reading and I want to share what I've learned. But the other big one is because I myself am Mexican and I've lived in the United States my entire life. And when I meet other Mexicans or Mexican Americans or second generation, whatever it may be, I feel that there is a very strong negative perception about Mexican history. And there's a lot of erroneous thoughts that are being shared about what Mexico's history has been, is, and will become. And so I just kind of want to tackle that because I think it's important. If there's a growing number of people here in the States that are of Mexican descendancy or Mexicans or, first chance, like whatever it may be. There's tons of us here. And I fear that most folks aren't getting their information accurately, or they're buying into these misconceptions of hatred and just, So I want to tackle that, okay? Mostly because it bothers me, but also because I think there's some really cool things that we're missing out when it comes to colonial Mexico. And I just want to get into that. So, in this specific series, we will be digging into the past to explore stories that kind of really changed and shaped what was then New Spain into what is now Mexico. And these aren't things that aren't talked about enough, which I think we should be, which is why I'm doing this. But I think the best way to do so is beginning with some crazy stuff, right? And I think I have just the story for y'all. We're going to be starting in 17th century Mexico City. It was busy. It was diverse. It was definitely under Spanish rule. But even though there was kind of like the system of rule by the Spanish, things weren't straightforward as we might think. There wasn't this, okay, these are the Spanish oppressors, and here are the indigenous and mestizo populations being oppressed. It wasn't as simple as that, even though we'd love it to be. At the time, Mexico City was definitely a melting pot. Spaniards, indigenous people, Africans, and mixed race groups were all living side by side, and not exactly in harmony. The Spanish elite definitely created this rigid racial hierarchy called the Sistema de Castas. I think we've all probably seen that image. Let me put it up on the screen so you guys can see, but of how there was different castes, and that's what they kind of attempted to build, and in a way they kind of did. But it didn't always work out that way as the Spanish had visioned, The Sistema de Castas was like a social rule book for who got what in colonial society. Spaniards were always at the top, indigenous and African people at the bottom, and then all kinds of mixed people were in the middle. But here's the thing. The system was supposed to keep everyone in their place, but the reality was it didn't work that way. Despite this whole setup, people from mixed backgrounds, especially those in the middle of the hierarchy like mestizos, found ways to challenge the system. They worked as artisans, vendors, and in other jobs that connect them to the elite and to the poor. In a way, they didn't just survive under colonial rule, they made their own space within it. And I'll get into that. So, furthermore, in this specific episode, I'm going to cover and take a closer look at how these everyday people, the plebeians, the plebes, as however you want to put them, the common folk, lived, how they resisted, and how they also thrived in a society that definitely was stacked against them. I will point out how this racial hierarchy that the Spanish elite loved to control wasn't as solid as they thought it to be. So, stick around as I dive into the world of the Plebeian Society in colonial Mexico City. There's a lot to uncover about how people navigated the limits of racial domination back then. So let's go. All right, so let's set the stage. By the 1600s, Mexico City had grown into one of the biggest cities in the Spanish Empire. And the Spanish Empire was massive by then, okay? It was ridiculous. From North America all the way to South America. It was just massive. And it wasn't just the political and economical capital of New Spain. It was also a cultural melting pot. You had Spaniards, of course, but also indigenous people, Africans, Asians, and a growing number of people from all sorts of backgrounds as they intermingled, and that is what they called castas. So, how did this all work? Well, the Spanish wanted to keep control, so they created this racial hierarchy, the system that we now know as Sistema de Castas. The system divided people into different categories based on how Spanish their blood was. And surprise, surprise, the Spaniards put themselves right at the top. But it wasn't just about race. This hierarchy was designed to control everything. Who got the best jobs, who held power, and even who could marry whom. In theory, it was supposed to keep Spanish dominance intact. But as always in history, things didn't go as planned. The city's population was incredibly diverse, but it wasn't just about race, it was also about class too. Two very different things that we need to remember, race and class. Very different. Mexico City had wealthy Spaniards living in fancy houses, but they shared space with poor Spaniards, indigenous people, and the castas, all crammed together into these ridiculously busy streets. And if you've been to Mexico City lately, I'm sure the chaos of Mexico City has not changed much in the chaotic sense of it. Just from what I've been able to read, it seems like it's, maybe nowadays we have cars and all this other stuff, but the chaos is still there. But anyways, life was happening side by side. But the experiences of each group were completely different. For the Spanish elite, the system was perfect, though. It gave them power and control, and they could justify their rule by claiming they were the most civilized group. But for everyone else, especially the plebes, the everyday working people, the system was a constant reminder of their kind of place at the bottom of the food chain. So the Sistema de Castas wasn't just about race. My tongue is all messed up. But it was also about maintaining social order. The idea was that if everyone knew their place, the Spanish could rule more easily. But as we'll see, the plebes didn't always follow the rules, and I consider myself a plebe. I'm not rich by any means, so I kind of get that. I get it. I get why you wouldn't want to follow the rules of dickish people set up, up in their high stools or whatever. I get it. So let's dive into that. So this Sistema de Castas was interesting. The Spanish used this system to rank everyone in colonial society based on their racial background. It wasn't just about who you were, but who your parents and grandparents were too. The idea was pretty simple. The more Spanish you were, the higher up you were on the social ladder. Now, in theory, this system was supposed to make sure that the Spanish stayed on top and everyone else knew their place. But in practice, it was more complicated than that. People from mixed backgrounds like mestizos and muletos were constantly challenging the rules and finding ways to move up the social ladder. Take mestizos, for example. They were supposed to be stuck somewhere in the middle of the social order, never quite Spanish, but also not indigenous or African. But many of them found ways to climb up the ranks, especially in urban areas like Mexico City. They worked as artisans, merchants, and even landowners. And guess what? The more wealthy or skilled they had, the more the lines of the Sistema de Castas started to blur. This is where the limits of racial domination started to show. The Spanish elite thought they could control society through this racial hierarchy. But when it came down to it, class and wealth played a huge role too. If you were a mestizo who was successful enough, you could definitely find ways to bypass the system. I mean, we can see it in nowadays, Just because you start at one point doesn't mean it's going to define your whole point or your financial stance in this society. But anyways, people weren't just defined by the race, but by their status, money, and definitely their connections. And I think we see that in our modern day as well. This isn't to say that the Sistema de Castas didn't matter. It absolutely did. For most people, race was a huge factor in determining what they could or couldn't do. But for some, especially in cities like Mexico City, it wasn't always a life sentence. There were definitely loopholes, and some people definitely found them. And a good comparison might be like to compare that to the caste system in India. That is a very rigorous system, and it's nearly impossible, from what I understand, to be able to do what was happening in Mexico with the caste system that the Spanish imposed. All right, but yeah, just think of it that way, okay? Anyways, And this is actually where things definitely got a little bit more interesting if you look into it. The plebes, they didn't just follow racial rules set out by the elite. They worked together, they lived in the same neighborhoods, and often didn't care much about the fine distinction of the caste system. For them, survival was the priority, not sticking to some rigid racial hierarchy. In fact, some historians argued that the Spanish elite used the sistema de castas more as a way to control people through division, keeping different racial groups separated and in competition with each other instead of uniting against the ruling class. Makes sense, right? If you're at the top. But as we've seen throughout history, and especially in this case, these divisions weren't always enough to stop people from pushing back. The plebeians weren't just passive rule followers of the system. They resisted, adapted, and in many cases found ways to bend or even break the rules. So, let's go ahead and jump into the daily lives of plebes. All right. So these were like the laborers, the street vendors and artisans, and the small-time traders who made Mexico City run, the everyday people. In a city as big as and diverse as Mexico City, you had this unique blend of people from all sorts of backgrounds. Indigenous folks, mestizos, mulattos, Africans, and even poor Spaniards were living and working side by side. You'd see a street vendor selling tamales next to a Spanish silversmith or an indigenous woman working in a Spanish household. But life for the plebeians weren't easy. Wasn't easy. They worked long hours in low-paying jobs, and most of them lived in cramped, often unsanitary conditions. The city's wealth was deeply concentrated in the hands of the elite, while the plebes were left to scrape by. Yet, despite the tough conditions, plebes formed strong social networks, and I think that's still very much visible to this day if you were to go to Mexico City. And I think you can definitely tell nowadays who's insanely well off and who is middle class and who's kind of maybe not doing so well financially. And I think that's unfortunately very visible when you do go to Mexico City. But I think that also allows us to kind of also see how things have maybe not changed much over the past 400 years or so. Anyways, family, friendships, and community were everything to the plebeian community. One way they definitely built these networks was through systems called like compadrazgo, or you probably heard the term compadre, comadre. Yes, that. The practice of choosing godparents for your children. This is kind of the system wasn't just about religion. It was a way of strengthening. Oh, sorry, my English just is struggling today. But it was a way to strengthen social ties, build alliances, and gain support in time of need. And as you know, we do have a lot of connection of compadrazgos to the Catholic Church, but I think it's important to note that it went beyond religion. Another important social structure was the cofradías, or religious brotherhoods. These were more than just religious groups. They acted like social clubs where people of similar backgrounds or trades could support each other financially and socially. Whether it was helping out with funeral expenses or organizing a feast day, the cofradías played a huge role in keeping the plebeian community connected. And even though the Spanish elite looked down on them, plebeians had their own sense of pride and belonging. They didn't always accept the labels or restrictions that the sistema de castas put on them, and because plebeians worked so closely with each other, race sometimes took a backseat to class and survival. If you were struggling to make a living, you didn't have a luxury of caring too much about who had more Spanish blood. No. And this kind of social mixing really freaked out the Spanish elite. They were terrified that the plebeians, especially the mestizos, mulattos, and Africans, would unite and cause trouble. The elite used every tool they had to try to keep the plebeians divided. But in reality, daily life for these communities wasn't as segregated as the elites wanted it to be. It just was not possible. Not at all. No. Plebeians shared food, work, and sometimes even housing. It was a multicultural, multilingual world. Definitely the first melting pot society in the Americas. I know we referenced the United States to be a melting pot, and it is. I'm not saying it's not, but I'm just saying in Mexico City, it was definitely a thing first. by a long shot. Anyways, so while the elites were trying to keep everyone in their neat little categories, the reality in Mexico City streets was much messier. And that's where we start to see the real limits of racial domination, because these communities didn't just accept their place in the system, they found ways to resist. Now, if you're wondering what happens when these tensions boil over, the 1962 Mexico City riot is a perfect example. All right, picture this. A city on edge, with racial and class divisions simmering for years, food shortages, frustration with the ruling elite, and the growing unrest among the plebes all come together in one explosive moment. In the months leading up to the riot, Mexico City was struggling with the food crisis. Corn, which was the staple food for most people in the city, had become scarce and expensive to an extent. And the plebes, they were already living in poverty. They were the ones hit the hardest. They were angry, and they saw the Spanish elite living in luxury while they were starving. On June 8th of 1692, sorry, I did get that right, not 1962, 1692, a group of plebeians gathered in the city's main square, the Plaza Mayor, to protest the high prices of corn. What started as a peaceful protest quickly turned into chaos. The crowd, made up of mestizos, indigenous people, and others from lower classes, were furious. They began attacking symbols of Spanish power like government buildings and elite homes. The viceroy at the time, and I hope I get this guy's name right because it's kind of a cool name. I'm not gonna lie. His name was Gaspar de la Cerda Sandoval. Tried to calm the situation, but it was a little bit too late. The riot literally spiraled out of control, and soon the crowd had set fire to the Palacio del Virrey, which is the viceroy's palace, right there in Plaza Mayor, not Playa, I wish, but no, Plaza Mayor. The fire destroyed parts of the palace and sent shockwaves throughout the city's elite. This riot was more than just a protest over food. It was a direct challenge to the Spanish elite's control over the city. For a brief moment, the plebes definitely took control of the streets, and the elite realized just how fragile their power really was. And I think this is an interesting note because I think a lot of people forget that prior to Mexican independence, there was tension and there was a lot of moments where things really spiraled out of control. And we could have easily had Mexico as a country been born way earlier, but it didn't occur. This was definitely not 1810 with Padre Hidalgo. This was a whole load of time before him. So just keep that in mind, please, because I think it's important to note that. Anyways, but despite the initial success of the riot, the Spanish authorities quickly regrouped. Within hours, they had called in reinforcements to put down the uprising. The plebeians didn't have the weapons or the organization to hold their ground, and the Spanish elite swiftly crushed the rebellion. Some people died. Actually, quite a few people died. Once the riot was over, though, the Spanish wasted no time in reasserting their control. The viceroy cracked down hard on the plebes, arresting hundreds and executing several leaders of the riot. But even though the rebellion was short-lived, it left a lasting impact on the city. In 1692, the riot showed not just how deep the tensions ran in colonial Mexico City, it was a clear sign that the sistema de castas wasn't enough to keep the plebes in check forever. The Spanish elite may have won the battle, but the plebeians had proven that they were a force to be reckoned with, and a force that would only grow and grow as the years came on. And it wasn't just about the riot itself. This event revealed the limits of racial and class domination in colonial society. The elite had built their power on a system of racial hierarchy, but the plebeians, especially those of mixed race, showed that they wouldn't simply just accept their place at the bottom. No, the cracks in the system were starting to show. So, what do we take from all this? The 1692 Mexico City riot wasn't just an isolated event. It was a clear message from the plebeians to the Spanish elite. We're here. We're not going to sit back while you control everything. The sistema de castas, this rigid racial hierarchy that the Spanish elite had created, was supposed to keep everyone in their place. But the riot showed that the system had limits. Plebeians, especially those of mixed race, weren't just passive victims of colonial rule. They pushed back when the system wasn't working for them. Simple as that. Even though the Spanish authorities regained control after the riot, they were forced to confront the reality that their power wasn't as secure as they thought. The plebeians had the potential to unite and challenge the status quo. And this isn't just about colonial Mexico. In 1692, Wright speaks to a larger truth about history. No system of power, no matter how well designed, can completely suppress the people it tries to control. Whether it's through open rebellion like the riot, or the quiet resistance of everyday life, people will always find ways to push back. So, what happened next? While the Spanish elite tightened their grips after the riot, the plebeians continued to find ways to resist the system. Over time, these tensions would build, and we'd eventually see movements that would reshape not just Mexico City, but all of New Spain. The story of the plebeians didn't end with the riot. It was just one chapter in a much bigger narrative of resistance, resilience, and change in colonial Mexico. And as we'll see in future episodes, the limit of racial domination would continue to be tested and challenged all the way up to the eventual fight for independence. But enough of this. I just want to give thanks to y'all for joining me on this little journey through the streets of 17th century Mexico City. There's so much more to uncover about the everyday lives of people in the past and how they shaped the world we live in today. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. Leave a comment below about what part of the story stood out to you the most. Sorry. And I'll see you in the next one as we continue to dive into the past here at Mon Carne de Poche. Alrighty, bye.